My son-in-law mocked me at dinner. He had no idea I owned the restaurant Lease. The knife squeaked against the plate before anyone said a word. 19 people at that table. My daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner. Candles burning low in glass jars down the center of a table dressed in white linen. The smell of garlic and warm bread, and faintly, the sea drifting in through the open patio doors behind us. And my son-in-law, Preston, 34 years old, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my first truck, decided the appetizer course was the exact moment to remind the room what he thought of me. "Dad here used to fix toilets for a living," he said, raising his glass toward his groomsmen with the easy confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder if a room was laughing with him or at him. Real blue-collar legend. Bet he never even eaten somewhere with cloth napkins before tonight. Laughter followed, not from everyone, but enough of it, rolling down that long table like something spilled that nobody was in a hurry to clean up. I did not react. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let my face do anything it wasn't told to do. I picked up my water glass, took one slow sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been, in the same ring of condensation it had already left on the tablecloth. What Preston did not know, what none of the 19 people at that table knew, including my own daughter, was that 6 months earlier, through a holding company with a name that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in that room, I had purchased the master lease on the very building we were sitting inside of, Bianchi's Trattoria. 14,000 square feet of prime real estate on the waterside of Clearwater, Florida, and every single month, the rent check that kept those lights burning and that kitchen running landed on my desk before it landed anywhere else in this town. I had absolutely no idea, sitting there with that water glass sweating in my hand, exactly how much that single fact was about to matter. Neither did he, and by the time either of us understood it fully, one of us would already have lost something he could never quite get back. My name is Harold Weaver, 63 years old, 41 years married to the same woman before I lost her to cancer 4 years ago, in the spring, in a hospital room that smelled permanently of antiseptic, and the lilies I kept bringing even after the nurses gently suggested I stop. One daughter, Melissa, 31 years old, the single best thing I ever helped build in this life. And for 38 years, I was a commercial plumbing contractor, Weaver Mechanical Systems, out of a cinder block office on Gulf to Bay Boulevard, about 6 miles inland from where that rehearsal dinner was happening the night everything started to turn. I did not start with money. I started with a used van that smelled like motor oil no matter how many times I cleaned it, $300 in a coffee can, and a toolbox that had belonged to my own father before he left. I learned this trade the way most men my age learned it, doing service calls in restaurant kitchens at 4 in the morning when a grease trap backed up and an entire dining room's worth of Saturday revenue depended on somebody showing up before the health inspector did. I learned, over the decades, which restaurant owners paid you on time and which ones needed a lien filed before they remembered your name. I learned, more than anything else, which buildings in this town were worth owning outright and which ones were worth walking straight past. By the time I turned 55, Weaver Mechanical wasn't only installing copper pipe and repairing commercial dishwashers anymore. We, and by we, I mean an LLC that never once had my personal name attached to any public filing a casual internet search would ever surface, had begun quietly investing in the commercial real estate, sitting directly underneath half the restaurants along the Gulf to Bay corridor. My hand still carried the calluses. 40 years of pipe wrenches and cramped crawl spaces does that to a man permanently, no matter how many leases he later signs in an air-conditioned attorney's office. But the same hands that signed those lease agreements were the hands that had once been slick with flux paste and PVC primer at 2 in the morning, kneeling on a wet concrete floor while some restaurant owner paced behind me asking how much longer it was going to take. The backstory wound sits further back than any of that, though, and I think about it more than I let on to anyone, even Melissa. My own father left our family when I was 9 years old. Not died, left. Packed a single duffel bag on a Tuesday afternoon in August and simply did not come home from his shift at the phosphate plant that evening, or the evening after that, or ever again. My mother cleaned houses for 11 years after that to keep the two of us fed and the lights on, and I remember, specific and exact, the sound of her key turning in our front door lock at 6:40 every single evening, and the smell of somebody else's pine sol still clinging to her hands when she wrapped her arms around me at the door. I built everything I ever built in this life because I made a decision at 9 years old, sitting on our porch steps, waiting for a truck that never came back down our street, that I would never once become the kind of man whose family had to sit and wonder if he was coming home. Every lease I ever signed, every job site I ever finished a day ahead of schedule, every dollar I ever quietly put toward a piece of commercial real estate nobody knew I owned. Some part of that, even now, at 63 years old, is still that 9-year-old boy trying to prove something to a man who was never, ever going to be around to see it. There was a stretch in my late 20s, before Melissa was even born, when none of it looked like it was going to work out at all. I remember one particular winter, a mild Florida winter, but cold enough at night to matter when your water heater's on the fritz and you can't afford to fix it yet. When Carol and I were 3 weeks behind on rent for the apartment we lived in above a bait and tackle shop on the old highway, and I just lost a service contract with a restaurant group because I'd quoted the job too low trying to win it, and then couldn't make the numbers work once the plumbing turned out worse than expected. Underneath the slab, I sat in that apartment one night, maybe 11 at night, doing math on the back of an invoice by lamplight, and I remember Carol coming to sit beside me without saying anything, just resting her head against my shoulder while I worked through numbers that weren't adding up no matter how many times I ran them. She never once told me it would be fine. She wasn't the kind of woman who said things just to soothe you. She simply stayed there next to me until I was done with the math, and then she said, "Whatever the number says, we're still doing this together," and went to bed. I finished the numbers an hour later. They were still bad, but something about not doing the math alone made the bad numbers feel survivable in a way they hadn't 10 minutes earlier. I think about that apartment above the bait shop more than people would probably expect, given where I ended up. I think about it specifically every time somebody who has never once had to do that kind of math by lamplight decides, casually, over a glass of wine at a rehearsal dinner, that a man like me probably doesn't belong somewhere with cloth napkins. That is exactly why what happened with Preston cut as deep as it did, because when a man spends his entire adult life building his identity around the single word dependable, being underestimated by someone he willingly let into his family does not feel like a small insult you can shrug off at a dinner table. It feels like a verdict handed down on your whole life's work, read aloud in front of witnesses. My wife, Carol, used to leave a cup of coffee sitting on the porch railing every single morning before I left for a job site. Not a note tucked under it. Never a note. Just the coffee itself, black. Exactly the way I've always taken it. Sitting there in the dark before 6 a.m., steam still curling off the top. She never once said the words, "Good morning," out loud in the 20 years I remember most clearly. She simply made certain that coffee was hot and waiting for me. Every single day. Rain or shine or hurricane warning. Until the year she finally got too sick to stand at that counter that early anymore. That was how she told me she still saw me, still thought of me, before either of us said a single word to start the day. Not with language, with coffee, and with timing, and with the simple fact that she never once forgot. Melissa, my daughter, became the second half of that same quiet devotion after Carol passed. It was Melissa who drove down every other Sunday afternoon with a casserole dish she always pretended she hadn't made specifically, just in case I was hungry. Even though we both understood perfectly well that she made it because she worried, genuinely worried, about her father eating dinner alone in an empty house with too many rooms in it. She is, and remains, the reason I have gotten out of bed on the mornings when getting out of bed has not felt automatic in the slightest. So when Melissa brought Preston Colfax home to meet me for the very first time, 3 years ago this past January, I wanted, more than almost anything else in my life at that point, to like him. I wanted it so badly that I think, looking back now, I let myself overlook things a more suspicious man would have caught on the very first visit. Preston came from money, or at least from money-adjacent circumstances. His family ran a small regional chain of boutique fitness studios spread across 3 counties. The kind of business with exposed brick walls and motivational quotes stenciled above the water fountains. Preston himself worked in what he called brand partnerships, a job title that seemed to shift slightly every single time I asked him to explain exactly what it meant on a normal Tuesday. He was well dressed in a way that never once looked accidental. A good watch. A haircut that clearly cost more than a haircut needs to cost. A handshake that gripped a half-second longer than it needed to. The kind of handshake designed less as a greeting and more as a small test, quietly checking to see whether the other man would be the one to flinch first. The first signal came 8 months into Preston and Melissa's relationship, at a 4th of July cookout I hosted at my house. The same house I raised Melissa in. The same garage, where I still keep my father's original pipe wrenches mounted on a pegboard. More sentiment at this point than actual tool. Preston walked through that garage while I was grilling, and I watched him look at those wrenches the exact way a man looks at a museum exhibit he privately finds a little embarrassing to be standing next to. Cute, he said. Just that one word, tossed over his shoulder as he kept walking toward the cooler. I let it go entirely. I told myself, standing there with tongs in my hand and smoke drifting up into a July sky, that he probably didn't mean anything by it. The explicit insult, the first one I couldn't quite talk myself out of, came the following Thanksgiving, in front of my sister Ruth and her husband Dell, at my own dining room table. Preston made a joke, delivered with an easy laugh that invited everyone else to laugh along with him, about old money families and new money families, and Harold's kind of no money at all family. Everyone at the table did that uncomfortable, half-second delayed laugh people do when they're still privately deciding whether something was actually funny or actually cruel. I smiled. I passed the stuffing down the table. I said absolutely nothing out loud, but I noticed it, and I remembered it. The way you remember a splinter you can't quite dig all the way out. Not sharply painful exactly, just present. Every single time you happen to close your hand around something. There was a third moment too, one I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. It happened at Melissa and Preston's engagement party, 7 months before the wedding. I overheard Preston on the phone in the hallway outside the restroom, his voice pitched low, but not quite low enough, telling someone, I never learned who, that Melissa's father did fine for himself, some contractor stuff, nothing serious, but the family solid middle class, nothing special. I stood there in that hallway with a glass of champagne going warm in my hand, and I thought about 31 commercial tenants paying rent into an account with my name quietly attached to it. And I said nothing, and I walked back into the party, and I smiled at my daughter across the room the way I always smiled at her. There was a fourth moment, smaller than the others, that I only understood the significance of much later. It happened at Preston's own birthday dinner, the one Melissa hosted at their rental house the autumn before the wedding. I brought a bottle of scotch as a gift, nothing extravagant, just something I thought he'd genuinely enjoy, and Preston had opened it in front of his friends and turned it over in his hands, reading the label, before saying, with a laugh that invited the room in on the joke, Careful, this is actually decent stuff, Harold. Didn't peg you for knowing the difference between this and whatever's on sale at the gas station. A few people laughed. Melissa didn't. I said something about how a man learns a few things in 60 years even without a fancy degree, and the moment passed, folded itself quietly into the growing stack of moments I was choosing, deliberately, not to react to yet. Looking back now, I understand that each of these moments functioned almost like a small test. One Preston was running without ever fully realizing he was running it. A way of checking, again and again, exactly how much he could say about me, in front of exactly how many witnesses, before something in the room finally pushed back. Every time nothing pushed back, the next comment got a little bolder. That is, I've come to believe, simply how it works with people who build relationships this way. The silence isn't received as patience. It's received as permission. What none of them knew, what I had never once mentioned at any family dinner, any 4th of July cookout, any Thanksgiving table, was that 4 years earlier, when the previous owner of a stretch of restaurant real estate along that same Gulf to Bay corridor decided it was finally time to retire and sell off his holdings, I had been the buyer. Not Weaver Mechanical, the name everyone in this family had heard 100 times. A separate entity entirely, Sunrise Cove Holdings LLC, registered through a Tampa attorney who filed the paperwork in a way that kept my personal name off of anything a casual internet search or a casual son-in-law would ever stumble across. I had 31 commercial tenants at that point paying rent directly to that LLC every single month. Bianchi's Trattoria, where Melissa and Preston would eventually choose to hold their rehearsal dinner 11 months later, happened to be one of them. I did not plan that particular symmetry. I want to be completely honest about that part, because it matters. When Melissa first told me she and Preston had picked Bianchi's for the rehearsal dinner because it has that romantic old Florida charm, Dad, you're going to love it. I nearly told her right then and there that I already knew every square foot of that dining room better than she ever would. I nearly told her I had personally approved the outdoor patio expansion permit for that building 2 years earlier, sitting at my own kitchen table reviewing blueprints with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. But something in me, the same something that had quietly absorbed Preston's jokes at 2 separate family holidays without a single word of complaint, decided instead to wait patiently and see exactly what kind of man showed up to that dinner when he believed, with total confidence, that no one holding any real power over him was watching. I did not have to wait very long at all. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for 7:30 on a Friday evening in early March. I remember the exact time because I remember checking my watch out of a lifelong habit before we all sat down. 7:22 exactly. The same habit I've kept since my very first job site as a young man. Always know precisely how much daylight you have left before you commit to something you may not be able to undo. The dining room smelled like garlic and warm baked bread and faintly, like the sea drifting in through the open patio doors along the back wall. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing the candle smoke into lazy, unhurried circles above our heads. Preston's toast started warm enough, the way these things almost always do. He talked about how much he loved Melissa, how genuinely lucky he felt, the usual rehearsal dinner sentiment that makes almost everyone's eyes go a little soft around the edges. He told a story about the 2 of them getting lost on a hiking trail in North Carolina and laughing about it for 4 hours afterward. He told another about the first time he met Melissa's roommate and how nervous he'd been. The room was warm. I remember thinking, watching him, that maybe I'd misjudged him after all. Then, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, he pivoted. "And to Dad here," he said, turning his glass toward me with a grin that had an edge underneath that I recognized immediately. The same edge I'd seen at that 4th of July cookout and that Thanksgiving table. Real blue-collar legend. Fixed toilets for a living. Honestly didn't think guys like him got invited to places with cloth napkins. The laughter that followed wasn't universal, and I want to be fair about that. Melissa's face went tight and pale in a way that told me immediately she hadn't expected it either, hadn't given him permission for it, hadn't known it was coming any more than I had. My sister, Ruth's husband, Dell, looked down at his plate and pushed a piece of bread around it without eating it. But 3 or 4 of Preston's groomsmen, young men in their late 20s who I'd met exactly twice, laughed aloud, easy laugh of men who have never once had to worry, not for a single day of their lives, about where their next paycheck was coming from. I picked up my water glass. I took one slow sip. I set it back down in the exact ring of condensation it had already left on the tablecloth. "Careful with that fork too, Harold," Preston added, riding the small wave of laughter for one more line before it could fully die out on its own. "Wouldn't want you straining something." My hands did not shake. My voice, when I finally spoke, came out even and unhurried. The same voice I've used for 40 years explaining to a homeowner exactly what was wrong beneath their foundation. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume to carry weight. "Nice place," I said, letting my eyes travel slowly around the dining room, the exposed brick along the far wall, the hand-painted beams running the length of the ceiling, the patio doors standing open to the darkening water outside. "Bianchi did a beautiful job with this building." "You know the place?" one of the groomsmen asked, mostly out of politeness, the way you ask a question when you're not actually expecting an interesting answer. "I know it pretty well," I said, and I left it exactly there, resting on the table like a stone nobody at that table yet understood the weight of. Something settled into my chest in that exact moment, not anger, not yet. Something quieter and colder than that, like furniture being moved slowly into a room I had never asked to have furnished. I had absolutely no idea, sitting there with a water glass, sweating in my hand, and 40 years of calluses folded quietly in my lap, exactly how this particular chapter of the story would eventually end. I only knew, with total and complete certainty, that whatever ending arrived, it would happen entirely on my terms, and not on his. I did not confront Preston that night. I sat through the rest of the dinner, through dessert, through the round of toasts that followed his, and I laughed politely at the appropriate moments and complimented the tiramisu, and shook every hand that was extended to me on the way out the door, including Preston's, gripping it back with exactly the same half-second too long pressure he'd offered me, and watching, with some quiet satisfaction, the flicker of confusion that crossed his face when I didn't let go first. I did not confront him the next morning either, standing alone in the church parking lot, in the gray 5 a.m. light before the wedding, my coffee going lukewarm in a paper cup, while I watched him laugh easily with his groomsmen across the lot, adjusting his cufflinks, utterly unbothered, as though the previous evening had simply evaporated from his memory the moment it stopped being useful to him. The wedding itself went off without a single visible incident. Melissa was radiant in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. The way the late afternoon light caught the edge of her veil as she walked down the aisle past rows of folding chairs set up on the beach. The way her voice caught, just slightly, on the word always during her vows. For 6 hours, I set every single thing I knew aside, every splinter I'd been carrying since that Thanksgiving table, and I simply watched my daughter marry the man she loved, because that day was never, under any circumstances, going to be about me. But 3 weeks later, sitting at my own kitchen table going through the quarterly management report from the property firm I'd hired to run the day-to-day operations of the Sunrise Cove portfolio, a firm operating under strict, standing instructions never to mention my personal name to any tenant ever, under any circumstance whatsoever, something crossed my desk that changed the entire shape of what came next. Bianchi's Trattoria was 90 days behind on rent, $41,000 behind, to be exact, a number that sat there on the page in plain black type, like it belonged to somebody else's building entirely. Attached to the management firm's collections file was a printed email chain between the restaurant general manager and someone signing off, simply as P. Colfax, Preston, regarding what the subject line called the Brand Partnership Consulting Fee for Q1. I sat at my kitchen table at exactly 9:14 in the morning, a full coffee going cold and untouched beside me, and I read every single line of that email chain twice through slowly, the way I've always read a set of blueprints before I let a crew break ground on anything. Preston, it turned out, had spent the better part of a year quietly running what one of the invoices called a vendor advisory retainer through 3 separate restaurants scattered along that same strip of the Gulf to Bay corridor, charging each business owner a monthly consulting fee for social media growth strategy that, based on the performance numbers attached to the file, had produced almost nothing measurable in return. Bianchi's owner, a soft-spoken man named Tony Bianchi Jr. I'd met him exactly twice in 4 years of owning his lease, both times briefly, both times through the property management firm's intermediary, had fallen behind on his rent in no small part because he had been quietly bleeding $2,000 a month to my own son-in-law for services that, by any honest measure, simply were not working. The most damning line in the entire chain was buried 3 messages deep, where Tony had written to his own bookkeeper, almost offhandedly, in a message never intended for anyone else's eyes. Preston says not to worry about the lease, says the landlord company never actually checks anything closely. Guy who owns it doesn't even know what he owns half the time. My hands went cold. In March, in Florida, on a morning already climbing toward 78 humid degrees outside my kitchen window. They went cold anyway, the way they used to go cold, decades earlier, the first time a job site inspector told me a foundation I'd worked on for 6 weeks was structurally unsound and would need to come out entirely. I read that line a second time. Guy who owns it doesn't even know what he owns half the time. My own son-in-law, describing me, in writing, to a tenant, without either one of them having the faintest idea he was describing his own father-in-law. The very same man he had mocked at a rehearsal dinner 3 weeks earlier for supposedly not belonging in a room with cloth napkins. Everything got slow after that, like the volume on the entire world had been turned all the way down to nothing. I sat at that kitchen table for 11 full minutes without moving, in the exact same way I remember sitting at that same table the morning after Carol's funeral, when the house had gone that particular kind of quiet that isn't peaceful at all, just simply empty. Room after room of it. I got up from that table once, somewhere in those 11 minutes, and walked out to the porch, The same porch where Carol used to leave my coffee every morning for 20 years. I stood there looking out at the yard, at the same lemon tree Melissa would later plant her own version of at her rental house, and I thought about how strange it was that the exact spot where I'd received the smallest, quietest proof of being loved every single morning for 2 decades was now the same spot where I was standing while I absorbed the largest, quietest proof of being deceived by the man who'd married my daughter. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people sometimes assume a moment like this comes with tears, and for me it didn't. It came instead with a kind of stillness that felt almost clinical, the same stillness I remember from standing over a slab that had failed inspection, staring at a problem that was now, unavoidably, mine to solve. Then, at 9:25 that morning, I picked up the phone and called my property manager, and I did not confront anyone. Not yet, because a man who has spent 40 years reading a length of pipe before he ever puts a cutter to it does not act on the very first thing he sees. He follows the line all the way to wherever it actually leads, no matter how long that takes, and no matter how much it costs him privately to wait. The next call I made, that same afternoon, was to Ray Delgado, a retired Pinellas County Code Enforcement investigator I'd worked with twice before over the years, back when a tenant on one of my earliest properties tried to claim I'd never properly permitted a kitchen renovation. Ray was 71 years old, moved slowly these days, with a bad hip he never complained about, and noticed absolutely everything. We met at a diner off Route 19, not Bianchi's, obviously, not anywhere close to it, at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the smell of old coffee and fryer grease thick in the air around us. I laid out everything I had. Ray read the email chain twice through, exactly the way I had, then set his reading glasses down carefully on the laminate tabletop between us. "You understand what you're looking at here," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Tell me anyway," I said. "I need to hear somebody else say it out loud." "Your son-in-law isn't running a marketing business, Harold. He's running a soft extortion, and he's dressed it up well enough that most people would never call it that out loud. He tells small business owners their landlord's a fool who doesn't watch his own books. Then he charges them a monthly fee for protection, disguised as consulting, because if they don't pay him, he implies, gently but clearly enough, that their lease renewal might not go quite so smooth next time it comes up. I've seen 4 versions of this exact scheme over 30 years on the job. It's always dressed up a little different, but it's always the same bones underneath." He tapped a printed page in front of him with one finger. "This line here, guy who owns it doesn't even know what he owns half the time. That's not really an insult about you, not primarily. That's the entire product he's selling to these business owners. Your supposed ignorance is the exact thing they think they're paying him to protect them from." I sat with that for a long moment, the diner ceiling fan clicking faintly overhead, the smell of a fryer somewhere behind the counter drifting out toward us every few seconds. "At 30, Ray said finally, folding his hands on the table, "a guy like Preston runs a small hustle like this because he's chasing a thrill, or chasing rent money, or chasing something he can't quite name yet. At Preston's age, with his in-laws watching, with a wedding just behind him. This isn't chaos anymore, Harold. This is accounting." He sat down at some point and did the actual math on exactly how much he thought he could take, and exactly how little risk he believed he was carrying while he took it. That line stuck with me the way certain things simply do. The way Carol's coffee on the porch railing has stuck with me for 4 years now. The way my mother's key turning in our front door lock at 6:40 every evening has stuck with me for 54 years. At Preston's age, this isn't chaos anymore. This is accounting. Ray asked me to walk him through every family interaction I could remember involving Preston, going back to that first 4th of July cookout. We sat in that diner booth for nearly 2 hours while I recounted them one by one. The comment about the pipe wrenches, the Thanksgiving joke about no-money families, the overheard phone call at the engagement party. Ray took notes on a small spiral pad the entire time, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore checkout counter, and every so often he'd stop me and ask me to repeat something almost word for word. "You notice something," he said, about halfway through, setting his pen down. "Every single one of these moments happened in front of an audience. Never once alone with you. Never once just the 2 of you in a room. A man who genuinely respects you doesn't need witnesses to feel comfortable around you. A man who's built his entire relationship with you around managing what you think of him needs an audience every time, because the audience is who he's actually performing for. You were never really the point of any of those jokes, Harold. The room was. That observation sat with me for days afterward, turning over slowly, the way a stone tumbles in a rock polisher until it finally comes out smooth enough to see something in it. I thought about every holiday table, every cookout, every engagement party, and I realized Ray was right in a way I hadn't let myself see clearly before. Preston had never once made one of those comments to my face when we were alone together. Not in the driveway, not carrying groceries in from his car, not during the one fishing trip Melissa had talked the two of us into taking together the previous autumn. Alone, he was almost painfully polite to me, careful, even solicitous. It was only ever in a crowded room, with witnesses primed to laugh, that the other version of him surfaced. "What do you want to do with this?" Ray asked me. "I want to know everything, before I do anything," I said. "I want to know every business he's touched, every dollar he's taken, every word he's used to describe me behind my back. And then I want him to find out all at once, in front of the exact people who need to see it." Ray nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already thinking 3 steps further down the road than the person sitting across from him. "Then we do this the slow way," he said. "Same way I always did it on the job. You don't move on a case until the case can't move on you." Before we left that diner, Ray gave me one more piece of advice I've carried with me since, long after the case itself was closed. "Whatever you decide to do with all this, Harold, do it in a way your daughter can respect afterward, not just a way that satisfies you tonight. You've got one shot to show her exactly what dignity looks like under pressure. Anger she'll forget by Christmas. But if she watches her father handle the worst moment of this whole situation with total composure, she'll carry that with her the rest of her life, in every relationship she has after this one." I paid the check that afternoon, shook his hand at the door, and drove home along the coast road with the windows down, turning that particular piece of advice over and over the entire way, understanding, even then, that it mattered more than almost anything else Ray had told me. I did not confront Preston that week. I did not confront him the following month either. Instead, for the next 11 weeks, I performed something close to normalcy that took more sustained effort than any single physical job I have ever completed in my life, including the 6-week commercial remodel I once finished during a hurricane evacuation with half my crew stuck on the wrong side of a closed bridge. I sat across from Preston at Melissa's 32nd birthday dinner in April and asked him, with what I hoped sounded like genuine interest, how the brand partnership business was coming along. I watched him answer with a version of easy confidence that I now understood, with total clarity, was built entirely on the assumption that I would never look closely enough, or care enough, to ever catch him at any of it. I sat across from him again at a Mother's Day brunch in early May, listening to him describe a big new client he was courting, some regional gym franchise, and I nodded along and asked a follow-up question or two, my stomach doing something complicated the entire time, and I did not let a single flicker of it reach my face. There was a Tuesday evening in late April, in particular, that I still think about more than almost any other moment from those 11 weeks. Melissa had invited me over for dinner at the small rental house she and Preston shared, a simple pasta dish she'd made herself, and Preston had come home late from a client meeting, tie-loosened, apologizing for the delay, kissing Melissa on the top of the head before he even set his bag down. He asked me how the crew was doing on a strip mall renovation job I'd mentioned weeks earlier. Remembered a detail about it I'd nearly forgotten myself, and for almost 45 minutes across that dinner table, I found myself genuinely enjoying his company, laughing at an actual joke he made about airport parking, forgetting entirely, for most of an hour, what I already knew was sitting in a folder at a bank 14 miles away. I remember standing at my truck afterward, keys in hand, feeling something close to shame at how easily I'd let myself enjoy an evening with a man I already knew was hollowed out underneath. I told myself it wasn't dishonest, what I was doing. I told myself a man doesn't owe an explanation of his suspicions to someone he hasn't finished investigating yet. But it cost something, all the same, sitting at that table and being, for one evening, Exactly the father-in-law Preston had always assumed I was too simple to be anything other than. I kept a small notebook in the glove compartment of my truck that spring, the same brand of drugstore spiral pad Ray carried, and after every one of those family dinners, I would sit in the parking lot for a few minutes afterward and write down anything Preston had said that seemed worth remembering. A client name, a dollar figure, an offhand comment about how landlords never really pay attention. Some nights, there was nothing worth writing down at all, just an ordinary dinner between people who loved each other, or believed they did. Other nights, I filled half a page. By the end of May, I had 11 of those pages, and reading back through them later, in order, felt less like reading notes, and more like watching a slow-motion film of a man revealing himself one dinner at a time, entirely unaware anyone was still filming. Meanwhile, quietly, methodically, I authorized my property management firm to pull a complete audit of every single tenant Preston had approached with his so-called consulting retainer across my holdings, 3 restaurants and 1 boutique gym, all sitting inside properties I own through Sunrise Cove Holdings, plus a 5th business, a hair salon 2 doors down from Bianchi's, that I hadn't even initially realized was connected until the audit surfaced it. I had Ray Delgado help me document exact timestamps on every email, every invoice, every late rent notice that traced back, directly or indirectly, to Preston's fee quietly draining a tenant's cash flow month after month. I drove out to that hair salon myself on a Wednesday afternoon in early May and sat down with the owner, a woman named Denise who had run the place for 19 years, and looked at me with open suspicion the entire first 10 minutes of our conversation, before I finally explained, carefully, exactly who I was and why I was asking. Denise's hands were shaking slightly by the time she finished telling me her version of events. Preston had told her, almost verbatim, the same line he'd told Tony, that the landlord company barely paid attention to what was happening in these buildings, and that a little consulting insurance, as he'd apparently called it once, wasn't a bad idea given how easily a lease could quietly not get renewed. I asked Denise, before I left her shop that afternoon, whether she'd ever mentioned any of this to Preston's face, pushed back on it even a little. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't push back on a guy like that," she said, sweeping loose hair off the floor around her station out of pure habit while we talked. "He's never rude to your face, never once raises his voice. He just has this way of mentioning, real casual, that he knows the property manager, knows the landlord's people, knows how these leases usually get decided. You start wondering if maybe it's easier just to pay the $2,000 a month and find out." She stopped sweeping and looked at me directly. "You're really the landlord? This whole time?" "This whole time," I said. "Does he know that?" "Not yet." She almost smiled at that, the first real one since I'd sat down. I'd pay good money for a chair with a view of that conversation. I also drove 40 minutes north to speak with the 4th business owner on the list, a gym franchise manager named Carlos who'd only been renting from me for 18 months. Carlos was more guarded than Denise had been, worried, understandably, about retaliation of some kind if word got back to Preston that he'd talked. It took 2 visits and a phone call from Patricia Yoon, laying out plainly that nothing he said could be used against him and that the documentation existed independent of his cooperation, before he agreed to put his account in writing. His version matched the others almost exactly, down to the specific phrase about the landlord not watching things closely, which told me, more than anything else in the entire file, that Preston hadn't improvised this approach. He'd built it once, tested it, and simply repeated it, business after business, the way you'd repeat any script that had worked the first time. I had all of it, every document, every sworn statement, every time-stamped email, notarized, copied, and secured inside a safe deposit box at a bank 14 miles from my house. The kind of methodical, unglamorous, patient work that had quietly built every single thing I have ever owned in this life. By late May, I had 11 months of financial records spanning 5 separate businesses for sworn tenant statements and 1 email chain in which Preston Colfax, in his own handwriting, in his own words, described his own father-in-law as a man who did not know what he owned. I had also, by that point, quietly begun the paperwork to terminate every one of Preston's so-called consulting arrangements across my properties, effective the 1st of June. The exact same week Melissa and Preston were already scheduled to host a small anniversary dinner at, of all possible places in this entire county, Bianchi's Trattoria, to celebrate 3 months of marriage. I did not choose that location. Melissa did, entirely on her own, with no knowledge of anything I had spent the last 2 months quietly assembling. But I will admit, sitting alone in my truck outside that restaurant the morning I confirmed the reservation myself with Tony, that I understood exactly what kind of symmetry I was about to be handed by simple coincidence, and I fully intended to use every single bit of it. The dinner was set for 7 p.m. on the first Saturday in June. 10 people this time, not 19, Melissa and Preston, myself, my sister Ruth, and her husband Dell, 2 of Preston's groomsmen who had apparently become regular fixtures at these family gatherings, and Tony, the restaurant's owner, whom I had specifically and quietly invited myself, telling Melissa only that Tony and I go back a little further than you'd think, sweetheart, and I'd like him at the table. I wore the same blue button-down shirt I wear to every family dinner I have ever attended in my life. No suit, no statement piece, nothing designed to signal that anything at all was different about this particular evening. My hands, when I shook Preston's at the door, still carried 40 years of calluses, and I let him grip a half-second too long, exactly the way he always did, and I did not flinch, and I watched, for just a moment, something small and uncertain flicker behind his eyes when I didn't. Dinner proceeded entirely normally for the first 20 minutes. Bread, wine, small talk about the honeymoon they were tentatively planning for the following spring, a discussion about whether Melissa should take the promotion she'd been offered at her firm. Ruth asked Preston about a fitness studio his family was supposedly opening in Tampa. He answered easily, comfortably, the same version of confidence I'd been watching all spring. The version I now understood had never once had to earn its own foundation. At exactly 7:41, when the appetizer plates had just been cleared and the waiter had stepped away toward the kitchen, I set my fork down carefully beside my plate, folded my hands together on the table in front of me, and spoke, calm, unhurried, the exact same voice I've used my entire adult life to explain to a homeowner precisely what was wrong beneath the foundation of their house. Preston, before we get to the main course, there's something I think everyone at this table has a right to hear. The table went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone at it senses the temperature has just changed, but nobody yet understands exactly why. You've been telling business owners in this building, and 2 others down the road, plus a hair salon I understand you'd forgotten to mention, that the landlord doesn't watch his books closely, that he doesn't know what he owns. I paused, letting that settle fully across the table, the same way I had let the water glass settle 3 months earlier. I know that, Preston, because I own this building. I have owned it for 4 years now. Tony here has been paying rent to my company the entire time you have known me. Preston's face did the first thing a human face does when the floor genuinely disappears out from under it without any warning at all. A half-second of total blankness. The body understanding the situation a beat before the mind is fully caught up to it. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, and I watched Ray Delgado's prediction land almost word for word. Denial, exactly the way he told me 3 months earlier it would start. Whatever emails you think you have, they're taken out of context, Harold. I set the folder on the table between us, 6 printed pages, each one flagged with a colored tab. Notarized copies pulled specifically from the safe deposit box, 3 miles from where we now sat. I slid it toward him 1 page at a time, deliberately, not all at once, the way you remove a splinter slowly enough that the entire thing comes out clean instead of breaking off halfway. This is Tony's email to his own bookkeeper, dated March 14th. I said, tapping the 3rd page with 1 finger. This is the invoice for your consulting retainer from that same month, billed against a service that produced, by Tony's own accounting, 0 measurable growth in foot traffic across 90 days. This is the same invoice structure, nearly word for word, sent to Denise at the hair salon 2 doors down. And this, I said, sliding the final page across the tablecloth, is the line where you describe me in writing, to a tenant, as a man who doesn't know what he owns. Preston's hand moved instinctively toward his wine glass, then stopped halfway there, The way a man's hand stops moving when he suddenly realizes that reaching for something ordinary in the middle of an entirely extraordinary moment will only make that moment worse for him. Harold, this is a complete misunderstanding. I never meant it the way it reads. I never meant. You meant every single word of it, Tony said quietly from the far end of the table, speaking for the first time all evening, his voice steady despite what it clearly cost him to say it out loud in front of everyone. You told me not to worry about my rent back in April, because the landlord was a pushover who'd never notice anything. You told me that standing in my own kitchen, right next to the walk-in cooler, while I was trying to figure out how I was going to make payroll that week. The second stage arrived quickly after that, almost exactly as if Preston could physically feel the ground continuing to shift beneath his own weight and reached instinctively for the nearest thing to grab onto. Look, Harold, whatever numbers you think you found here, I can make this right. All of it. Tonight, no lawyers, no mess, no reason for any of this to go any further than this table. We're family, for God's sake. We are family. I agreed, keeping my voice level, keeping my hands folded exactly where they'd been the entire time, which is precisely why I let this go on for 3 full months instead of 1 single day, Preston. I gave you every possible chance to be the man my daughter believes she married. The third stage, the self-destruction Ray had specifically warned me to watch for, the piece he'd told me would need absolutely no setup for me at all, arrived directly from Preston's own mouth, unprompted, the way it almost always does in moments like this. He turned toward one of his groomsmen, half under his breath, apparently believing the moment had shrunk small enough for the comet to disappear quietly into it. This is insane. The old man barely knows how to use email, and now he's playing landlord tycoon at my own anniversary dinner. Every single person at that table heard it clearly. Melissa heard it. Her face, when I glanced over at her, moved from confusion into something considerably harder and sadder in the space of that one sentence. At 7:58, exactly 17 minutes after I had first opened that folder, my attorney, a woman named Patricia Yoon, whom I had asked to wait quietly at the bar with an iced tea, dressed like any other diner enjoying an ordinary Saturday evening, walked over and calmly introduced herself to the table. She explained, without a shred of theater in her voice, that Sunrise Cove Holdings would be terminating Preston Colfax's access to any tenant across the entire property portfolio, effective immediately, and that documentation of the consulting arrangements had already been forwarded to the Florida Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, given the clear pattern established across 5 separate small businesses. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Patricia said quietly, her eyes moving briefly around the table before settling back on Preston. This is a documented pattern of financial misrepresentation directed at small business owners. What happens from this point forward isn't up to anyone sitting at this table. Preston did not say anything else for a long moment. He sat very still, the exact way a man sits when he finally, completely understands that the version of events he has been quietly telling himself for months has just been permanently overwritten, in front of witnesses, by the version everyone else at that table can now see clearly for themselves. There was one more moment, though, before the table finally broke apart, a moment I have thought about often in the years since. Preston looked up briefly at Melissa, and for just a second, something genuine passed across his face. Not calculation, not damage control, something that looked almost like the boy who had once cried at our wedding toast rehearsal because he'd said he'd never had a father figure who stuck around this long. Mel, he said quietly, I never wanted you to see any of this. I know, she said, and that was all she said. One of Preston's groomsmen, a younger man named Chase, who had laughed the loudest at the rehearsal dinner all those months earlier, pushed his chair back from the table entirely, his face pale under the restaurant's warm lighting. Preston, man, is any of this true? He asked, and I could hear, underneath the question, the sound of a friendship quietly recalculating itself in real time. Preston didn't answer him. He was still staring at the folder in front of him, at his own handwriting reproduced in black ink on notarized paper, and for a long moment nobody at that table said anything at all. The ceiling fan kept turning overhead. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, a pot lid clattered against a stove top, ordinary restaurant sounds continuing on exactly as they always had, indifferent to what had just happened 20 feet away. Ruth reached over at some point and put her hand over Dell's, and I caught her looking at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on my sister's face since our mother's funeral. Something between pride and sorrow, the two feelings apparently sharing the same space, without much difficulty. Patricia stayed only a few minutes longer, long enough to answer the 2 or 3 questions Preston's own attorney would likely need answered later, and then she excused herself quietly, the way a good attorney does, leaving the family to sort out whatever remained of the actual family business at that table. Tony walked over from the far end of the table before the evening fully ended, and stood beside my chair for a moment, and said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, "For years you've owned this building, Harold, and you never once made me feel small about it. Not once. I want you to know that." I told him it never occurred to me to. He nodded, and went back to check on his kitchen, because even in the middle of all this, a restaurant on a Saturday night still had a dinner service to finish, and Tony, unlike Preston, had never once forgotten what actually mattered while everything around him was falling apart. I want to be honest about what happened in the parking lot afterward, because the truth of it is more complicated than a simple, clean victory would suggest. I sat alone in my truck for almost 20 minutes before I finally turned the key. Not triumphant. Still, the engine off, the windows down, the smell of the Gulf drifting in off the water 2 blocks away, mixed faintly with the smell of garlic still clinging to my shirt from the dining room. A pool pump somewhere nearby cycled on with a low hum. Cicadas were already starting up in the palms across the parking lot, even though the sun had only just gone down. I felt something I had not fully expected to feel, sitting there in that quiet cab. Not just relief, though there was relief in it, somewhere underneath everything else. Something closer to grief. Grief for the version of Preston that Melissa had genuinely fallen in love with, the one who used to bring Carol's favorite lilies to the house before she passed, the one who had cried, actually cried, at our wedding toast rehearsal because he said he'd never had a father figure stick around this long in his entire life. I do not know even now whether that version of him was ever fully real, or whether it was simply the version he had calculated would work best on me from the very beginning. But some part of me mourned it anyway, sitting in that truck with the windows down, 40 years of calluses on hands that had just quietly and permanently ended the easiest chapter of his marriage. I thought, sitting there in that quiet cab, about my own father, too, in a way I hadn't expected to. Not because there was any real similarity between the two men. My father had simply vanished, no scheme, no calculation, just a duffel bag and an empty driveway. But because I recognized, for the first time in 54 years, that I had spent my entire adult life building a version of strength specifically designed to make sure no one in my family ever again had to sit at a table and be quietly diminished by someone who was supposed to protect them. And here I was anyway, at 63, having failed to see it happening to my own daughter for the better part of 3 years, until a spreadsheet finally told me what my own eyes had been too generous to notice on their own. I did not enjoy that particular thought, but I let myself sit with it anyway, because I have learned, over a long life, that the thoughts you most want to avoid are usually the ones worth sitting with the longest. Melissa knocked on my window 11 minutes later. She didn't say anything at first. She simply climbed into the passenger seat, the exact way she used to climb into that same seat when she was 16 years old and needed to sit in silence beside someone before she was ready to talk about whatever had happened that day. "How long did you know?" she finally asked, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the restaurant's darkened front window. "Since March," I said, "the week after the rehearsal dinner." She nodded slowly, still staring out at the water beyond the parking lot. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me keep having dinners with him, keep planning things with him, while you already knew all of this?" "Because I needed you to see it clearly for yourself, Mel. Not simply hear it secondhand from your father, filtered through everything I feel about him. I needed the evidence to speak for itself, in a room where you could watch it land." She didn't say much else that night, but she also did not go home with Preston. She came home with me instead, to the house she grew up in, and she slept in her old bedroom for the first time in 6 years, and I stood outside her closed door around midnight and listened to her crying quietly for a long time before I finally went to bed myself. Preston's consulting arrangements across all 5 businesses were formally terminated within the following week. The Florida Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into the pattern of fee arrangements roughly 2 months later. By the time that inquiry concluded, Preston had voluntarily settled with all 5 business owners rather than face a formal finding against him, refunding a combined total of $38,000. He and Melissa separated that same July and finalized their divorce the following spring, quietly, without much of the theatrics anyone might expect from a story shaped like this one, because by the time it actually happened, there simply wasn't very much left to fight over. Last I heard, through a mutual friend of Melissa's, Preston had left brand partnerships altogether and was working an entry-level sales position at a flooring distributor 2 counties over. Sometimes the bottom is the only honest place left to start building something real, and I hope, genuinely and without irony, that he finds his way toward doing exactly that eventually. Tony still runs Bianchi's Trattoria. Rent's current every single month now. Has been since the week after that dinner. I still own that lease, and I still stop in for dinner every few months, sitting at the same corner table by the patio doors, and Tony still refuses to let me pay for dessert no matter how many times I try to insist otherwise. Denise's salon made it through, too, though it was closer than I would have liked. I quietly waived 2 months of her rent that summer, not as charity. I was careful about that distinction, and so was she, but as a straightforward adjustment given everything her business had absorbed without her knowledge or consent. She sends me a Christmas card every December now, always signed the same way, from the chair with the good view. I still don't fully understand the joke, but I've stopped asking her to explain it, because whatever it means to her, it clearly still makes her laugh every time she writes it. Carlos, the gym manager, left the franchise about 4 months after everything settled, took a job managing a different fitness chain closer to where his kids went to school. I don't hold that against him. He did what he needed to do for his own family, the same as I did for mine, and he did it with more honesty than the man who'd put him in that position to begin with. Ray Delgado and I still meet at that same diner off Route 19 every few months. No particular business reason anymore. Just 2 men who've come to enjoy each other's company over eggs and bad coffee. He tells me, half joking, that I'd have made a decent investigator myself if I hadn't spent 40 years under other people's sinks instead. I tell him I got exactly the education I needed either way. A year later, Melissa lives 15 minutes from me, in a small rented house with a kitchen window that looks out over a lemon tree she planted herself the same week she moved in. She comes over most Sundays now, not out of guilt or lingering obligation, but because she has told me, more than once, that the quiet of my house has slowly started to feel like something worth keeping close, rather than something to escape from. She's dating again, carefully, a man named David who works in marine biology out of a research station on the Intracoastal, and who has never once, in the 8 months I've known him, made a single joke about my hands, or my truck, or the 38 years I spent underneath other people's kitchen sinks. I still drive the same F-150, still wear the same blue button-down shirts, still park on the street in front of restaurants when I don't need to make any particular point about anything. The truck doesn't tell anyone where I've been, or what I own, or what any of it means. It simply gets me where I'm going, the same way it always has. I finally had that old bathtub in the guest room redone last spring. Simple, white, nothing fancy at all. The kind of small overdue renovation I'd been putting off for 3 straight years for no real reason. I stood in the doorway one ordinary Tuesday morning with my coffee, looking at it, and I thought about how something so small and so completely ordinary can sit right next to something as large as what nearly split a family in half, and somehow both things simply become part of the same life, carried forward together. Some evenings, sitting out on that same porch where Carol used to leave my coffee every morning for 20 years, I still find myself running the whole thing back from the beginning. The pipe wrenches on the garage wall, the joke about no-money families, the water glass sweating in my hand at that rehearsal dinner. I don't run it back out of anger anymore. Most of that burned off somewhere around the 6-month mark, the way most anger eventually does if you let it. I run it back now mostly out of a kind of quiet gratitude, strange as that might sound, for the fact that the discovery came when it did, before there were children in the picture, before another decade of holidays had passed, before the pattern had time to root any deeper into my daughter's life than it already had. Melissa is 32 years old now. She has time ahead of her that Preston does not get to be part of anymore. And every single evening I sit on that porch, I understand a little more clearly just how much that fact is worth. There is a particular kind of peace in watching your child rebuild something honest out of something that briefly wasn't, and no amount of rent collected on any lease I own has ever come close to matching it. Here's the truth this entire story is really built around, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before you scroll on to whatever comes next. Money does not change people. It reveals them. Preston did not become someone new the night he mocked me across that rehearsal dinner table. He simply stopped hiding, for one unguarded moment, who he had been the entire time I'd known him. If you are sitting somewhere right now recognizing pieces of your own life inside this story, a son-in-law, a daughter-in-law, a business partner, a spouse who has started speaking about you in a tone you can't quite name out loud, but can absolutely feel underneath the words, I want you to know clearly that what you are noticing is not paranoia. It is awareness arriving later than you would have liked, but exactly when you needed it most. If you are an adult child watching a parent get quietly underestimated by someone else inside your own family, watching it happen year after year at holiday tables while you bite your tongue because you don't want to make an already tense situation worse, I see you clearly, and I want you to know that your parent very likely sees far more of it than you currently give them credit for. They are often simply choosing, deliberately and carefully, exactly when and how to respond, on their own timeline, not yours. And if you are the one in your family who has spent years quietly carrying the finances, the difficult decisions, the entire weight of responsibility that nobody else at the table seems to notice or ever thank you for, you are not invisible, no matter how invisible it has come to feel some nights. You are simply underestimated by people who have mistaken your patience for your actual limit. To anyone listening who loved someone the right way, fully and honestly, and still ended up hurt by them anyway, you loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two entirely different things, and only one of them was ever truly your responsibility to carry. Here is one practical thing you can do this week. If any part of the story has matched something happening in your own life right now, if you own commercial or residential property and lease it through a management company, pull your last 12 months of tenant correspondence yourself, not the summary version, the actual line items, and read every single email in full. If anything at all doesn't sit quite right with you, you are fully allowed to ask questions about it. You are not being paranoid. You are simply, finally awake to it. And if the story that hit closer to home for you tonight was less about property and more about a marriage, a business partnership, or a family member who has quietly been managing you rather than loving you, here is the same advice, shaped a little differently. Start writing things down. Dates, exact phrases, the small moments that don't add up. You do not need to act on any of it yet. You simply need to stop letting yourself doubt your own memory of what actually happened. I think often, too, about the fact that patterns like this one rarely start with the person who finally gets caught in them. Preston learned somewhere from someone that confidence delivered smoothly enough will usually go unquestioned, that a joke wrapped around a cruelty gives everyone at the table permission to laugh instead of object, that most people would rather keep the peace at dinner than risk the discomfort of calling something out in the moment. I don't know his father well enough to say for certain where he learned it, but I do know this. Whatever pattern you grew up watching at your own family's table, the one where somebody quietly got diminished every holiday while everyone else decided it was easier to laugh along, that pattern does not have to be the one you hand down to whoever comes after you. Somebody, at some point, has to be the one who finally sets the folder down on the table instead of passing the stuffing and staying quiet for one more year. I'll leave you with this question tonight, and I genuinely want you to sit with it rather than answer it too quickly. Is there someone in your life, right now, who has quietly built a version of you inside their own head that makes it easier for them to disrespect you? And if so, exactly how much longer do you plan on letting that particular version of you go uncorrected? Because somewhere out there tonight, at a table very much like the one I sat at, somebody is deciding, right now, whether tonight is finally the night they stop passing the stuffing and start opening the folder. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Harold handled this exactly right by waiting patiently and building his case carefully instead of confronting Preston the very first night at that rehearsal dinner. Drop a 2 if some part of you still feels genuine sympathy for Preston, or for the marriage that ultimately didn't survive this, even fully understanding everything he did. Drop a 3 if this story touched something real and specific in your own life, a moment where someone close to you underestimated you completely, and you quietly knew something they had no idea you knew. Tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it happens to be there right now, wherever you are. Someone out there is going to be watching this at 2 o'clock in the morning from somewhere I would genuinely never expect, and somehow, this will turn out to be the exact story they needed to hear tonight. That fact means something real to me every single time I read through these comments, one by one. If stories like this one mean something to you, if you've lived some version of being quietly underestimated by someone who was supposed to know better than that, I hope you'll consider staying with this channel a while longer. This was never meant to be just a place for entertainment. It's meant to be a place for people who have felt exactly what Harold felt in that dining room, looking for a little bit of honest company on the long way through it. A quiet, ordinary note to close on. None of this required rage to resolve. It only ever required patience, documentation, and a willingness to let the truth arrive on its own schedule rather than mine. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Clearwater, Florida to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, your local adult protective services, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet sound you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.